7 years ago, one of the most underrated movie trilogies concluded with War for the Planet of the Apes. In preparation for the newest installment in the franchise, I decided to go back and rewatch Rise of the Planet of the Apes, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, and War for the Planet of the Apes to see if they still hold up all these years later. I could spend my time talking about the film's revolutionary visual effects or the incredible acting of both the human and ape characters, but in this video I want to dive deep into the story. How effective was Caesar's story all these years later? Let's start from the beginning. Rise of the Planet of the Apes is a story about two things: identity and oppression. Almost every plot point in this movie ties into one of those two things. Sure, there are themes of corporate greed thrown in there, but the reason I want to focus on identity and oppression is because those are the themes that are explored through Caesar. When I talk about great movies on this channel, I usually am able to discuss a half dozen characters that are fairly well developed and fleshed out. I can definitely do that with the next two films in this trilogy. But Rise only focuses on developing two characters really, Caesar and Will, and these two characters are the ones that highlight these themes. The movie begins with a tragedy. We witness the murder of a mother trying to protect her son. After what is a major career setback, Will begrudgingly takes in this newborn ape until he knows what to do with him. Will is one of the more underrated characters in this trilogy, because Will easily could have just been the perfect father to Caesar, the human that we all know was there to support Caesar no matter what. But that's not the case. As Caesar grows up, we see that Will is a caring and loving father to Caesar, but it's important to note that Will's number one priority will always be curing Alzheimer's. We see how brutal Alzheimer's can be to someone, and the pain of losing his father is what has driven Will down this path. The reason I say Will is not the perfect father is because deep down, Will only loves Caesar as long as he is useful to curing Alzheimer's. Will only takes an interest in Caesar because of his extreme intellect. Will keep Caesar around because he can monitor his growth and the effectiveness of the ALZ-112. People may disagree with me and say Will loves Caesar like any father, but does he? Love isn't binary. You can love people to different degrees. Will loves his father more than anything and will do anything to help him. If Will loved Caesar as much, why does he keep Caesar locked up in his house? When he does take Caesar out, why does he put Caesar on a leash? Why does Will only try to bribe the keeper once his father dies? Well, because Caesar is an ape. Will repeatedly throughout the movie says that Caesar is not a pet, but at the end of the day, Will can only love Caesar as much as anyone can love a pet. It reminds me of those parents who have dogs and they say they love the dog as much as their child, but we all know when it comes down to it, the parent will always choose their child over their pet. And this limited love that Will can have for Caesar is where Caesar struggles the most. The reason I say Rise is a film about identity is because the main question this movie tries to answer is, who is Caesar? Caesar is raised to believe he is human. He wears clothes like a human. Even though he can't talk, he communicates to others like he is human. But most importantly, he sees Will as his actual father. Early in the movie, Caesar wants to go outside so he can play with other kids like any normal kid. But when he does, he gets attacked for it and is told to stay inside. Later on in the movie, when he sees his kinda grandfather get berated, he stands up for his family and protects them. What happens when he does this? He gets thrown in animal jail. Caesar throughout the movie gives the submissive gesture to Will, not because he sees Will as someone with authority, but because he trusts Will. When Caesar is scared to enter the ape sanctuary, he puts his trust in Will that everything will be okay. But Will leaves Caesar. He leaves Caesar to live in a cage, get abused by the keepers, and then get bullied by other apes. How can Caesar be human if this is how his father treats him? Throughout the beginning half of the movie, Caesar often shows shame about being an ape. Whenever he acts like a human, all is good. But the few times he does act like an ape, he gets in trouble. Who is Caesar if he is not human? The easy answer is to say Caesar is not human, he is an ape. But storytelling is more than just that. Caesar's identity crisis in this movie is an allegory for embracing who you are. Caesar all movie was embraced and loved as long as he acted like something he wasn't. He was even made to feel shame when he acted like his true nature. Caesar is loyal, kind, loving, and a great leader, all qualities we see in human beings. But Caesar is also an ape. and he realizes that after he enters the sanctuary. Shortly after the death of his father, Will returns to Caesar with the chance to finally be free, but as Caesar notices, he has a leash in his hand. Metaphorically, this moment is someone offering Caesar the opportunity to go back to being someone he isn't, going back to being a pet but acting like a human. Caesar declines. One could argue the culmination of this arc for Caesar is maybe the most memorable part of the movie. After Caesar is told to keep his stinking paws off Draco Malfoy, Caesar yells no. Caesar is tired of being told what to do. He's tired of being someone he isn't. He's tired of taking orders from others like he's a pet. This reborn Caesar will now rescue all the other apes and bring them back to the promised land. In this case, it's the forests. This is what's home to Caesar. This is where he belongs. What can people learn from Caesar? You can learn that you should never compromise who you are to please others. You can learn that sometimes you need to stand up for others like you who cannot stand up for themselves. You can also learn to never feel shame for who you are. These are all lessons Rise of the Planet of the Apes teaches us. But as I said earlier, this movie doesn't just focus on identity. It also focuses on oppression. I want to preface this by saying I am not someone who's ever dealt with oppression. I've lived one of the most privileged lives in one of the most privileged places. So while I may not be qualified to talk about oppression, I do want to do my best to give this movie the credit it deserves with how it addresses themes of oppression. For an ape, Caesar has it pretty good, right? He has a loving parent, he has an attic to himself where he can play around. When he's injured, he's privy to proper medical care. He even gets to go to the forests once in a while. So one could argue that Caesar has it pretty good, right? Well, let's examine this again. Caesar may have a loving father, but is that love unconditional? No. If Caesar wasn't passed down the ALZ 112 through his mother, would he be loved? No, he wouldn't be. Caesar gets to go to the forest, right? Well, only when Will lets him. Caesar, an ape, can only go to the forest when he's allowed to. Caesar has a home, right? But what happens when he tries to leave that home? He gets punished for it. The window in the attic is a major symbol of this trilogy, something that allows Caesar to look at the outside world. But narratively, that window is a barrier. Both times Caesar tries to pass that barrier, he gets in trouble. Every time Caesar, an ape, wants to go outside without permission, he gets in trouble. When Caesar is in the sanctuary for the first time, he draws the window as a way to comfort himself. Caesar shouldn't have tried to go outside. He should have just been grateful that he could even look outside. He should have been grateful for that window. But as he spends more time in the sanctuary, he starts to see the more blatant signs of oppression. The abuse these apes receive, the feeling that they should be grateful for this one tree. Some don't even get to be grateful for that. When Caesar and the apes escape, the way the humans react, you'd think the apes were trying to overthrow the government. The apes must be stopped at all costs, right? Because if they aren't stopped, they're going to end up in the forest. This whole final battle, if you will, the apes are just trying to go to the forest. They're just trying to go to where apes are naturally from. Oppression is when you have to fight and die just for the most basic rights. How many apes died in the third act of this movie just so other apes can live in the forest? The place apes were taken from in the beginning of the movie. When Caesar stands at the top of the tree at the end of the movie, that is freedom. Not this, not this. Caesar's story in this movie is beautiful. We got to witness the story of someone not only fighting for their freedom, but also someone discovering who they are and their place in the world. Before I move on to the other movies in the trilogy, I want to take a second to discuss the ending of the film. The ending credits begin with the realization that the simian flu, a flu proven deadly to humans, is being spread all over the world. Even though this version of Planet of the Apes is quite fresh and new, at the end of the day, it is still an adaptation. When a story is adapted, of course you are allowed to change a few things. A perfect one-to-one adaptation is quite boring. No one wants to see that. So while you are allowed to change things, there is one thing you are never allowed to change, and that is the values of the original story. The original Planet of the Apes films can be seen as a commentary on the Cold War, racial conflicts, oppression, animal cruelty, religious conflicts, and many others. Now, Rise of the Planet of the Apes doesn't need to touch on every single one of these themes, but it does need to touch on a few. We can see the commentary on oppression and animal cruelty, but not so much religious conflicts or Cold War commentary. When you think of Planet of the Apes, however, you usually think of one moment, and that is the moment Taylor finds the Statue of Liberty. For those who may not remember the original movie, astronaut Taylor believes he is on a foreign planet where apes rule humans. The movie ends, however, with the realization that they are just on Earth in the distant future. This moment is also a realization that humanity screwed themselves. They decided to blow themselves up with nukes, and they are the ones to blame for their own downfall. In the original movie, apes didn't rise per se. They filled in the vacuum left by humans destroying themselves. No matter what nation or country you are from, there is something so chilling about this scene. The realization that in this story, we were responsible for our own destruction. Not an asteroid, not some other natural disaster. We did it to ourselves. There's no moment in Rise of the Planet of the Apes that's as chilling as this, but the writers did their due diligence to honor that theme. The way the movie ends with the simian flu being spread all over the world is a modern take on that Statue of Liberty scene. Hence the title Planet of the Apes. We know that humans are going to fall somehow, and the way it happens in this movie is because of a virus that humans created. A virus created by corporations that were more focused on rushing a vaccine and capitalizing on the profits over the safety of it. In both the original Planet of the Apes and the new one, humans did it to themselves. The writers of Rise of the Planet of the Apes made sure to change the source material, but honor the values of said source material. And that is what every great adaptation does. The last thing I want to talk about with Rise of the Planet of the Apes is not something I talk about often on this channel, but it is something I think is very important, and that is the pacing and story structure. When you think about what this movie had to accomplish and how it's rather short for a modern blockbuster, it's insane how good this movie is. Here's a list of things that needed to be accomplished in this movie. 1. Establishing how humanity collapsed with the virus. 2. Developing Will and his relationship to his father. 3. Establishing Caesar and his character arc. 4. Depicting animal cruelty. 5. Establishing how the apes became smart. There's a lot to cover in 100 minutes. The next two films in the series really only need to focus on telling a good story. This film had to cover a lot with its plot, but the way this movie was able to do this was with excellent pacing. In storytelling, scenes should logically lead into each other. Scene A should lead into scene B should lead into scene C, so on and so forth. If scene A leads into scene B, but then scene C just happens out of the blue, that can hurt your pacing. Oftentimes on this channel, I reiterate my cardinal rule of storytelling, that characters must suffer the consequences of their actions. I often reference this rule when talking about characters, and how when they do something stupid, they should face the realistic consequences of that. I should really widen this definition because in reality, anything, not just characters, should have a realistic consequence, both good and bad. So what happens when you give a mother a drug that enhances their cognitive function? It gets passed on to their child. Granted, this is the only one where you can debate the reality of it, but this is a movie about talking apes, so let's stick with it. What happens when a scientist has an ape of incredible intelligence? He will keep the ape around so he can study it. What happens when a scientist sees how effective the drug can be on an ape who also has a father who is dangerously sick? He will try the drug on his father. What happens when he sees how effective the drug is on both apes and humans? He tells his boss about it to get extra funding. What happens when a corporation feels like they have a product that can change the world? They try to mass produce it at a rapid scale. What happens when a corporation cuts corners for profits? Bad things happen. This movie has such a great flow to it. Everything perfectly leads into everything else. Let's look at a more character-focused level. What happens when you raise an ape in your home? Eventually, that ape grows up and becomes an adult. What happens when you try to enclose an ape in a confined space? It will try to leave that space. What happens when a grown ape mixes in the world of humans? Animal services get called and the ape is thrown into a penitentiary. What happens when an ape who can think like a human is treated like an animal? It will rebel. Things in this movie don't happen by accident. There are none, if not very few, coincidences in this movie. Every action has a realistic reaction, and that is why this movie is able to effectively cover so much in such a short amount of time. Rise of the Planet of the Apes is a marvel. Not only did it do a great job of setting up this world, but it also created characters with so much depth that we can't help but root for. What's so crazy about this trilogy is that the first movie is so good, but the second one is even better. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is one of the best movies I have ever seen. The character work in this film is simply remarkable. When I spoke about Rise, I mentioned how that movie had a lot it needed to cover with its plot, and it did so very well. Dawn, on the other hand, is very fortunate in that there's not much plot to cover. In the grand scope of the trilogy, the only thing this movie needs to set up is a war between humans and apes. That's it. And considering this movie is more than half an hour longer than Rise, that means that Dawn has the luxury of being able to devote a lot of time to character, and I mean a lot. When you think of a movie that sets up a war between two sides, you'd think that one side are the good guys and one side are the bad guys. Even in the first film, it kind of did this. The apes were pretty much all good and the humans were mostly bad, so it would have been so easy to just set up a movie about good guys versus bad guys, but that's not what this movie does. This movie spends so much time creating complex characters that even though the plot is humans versus apes, not all characters reflect that. There are four major characters in this film: Caesar, Malcolm, Koba, and Dreyfus. If you can put these four characters on a scale to determine their loyalty, Koba and Dreyfus are the most committed to their cause, while Caesar and Malcolm are committed to their side but value peace more than anything. I want to begin my discussion of Dawn by discussing the two characters at the end of this scale, Koba and Dreyfus, because these two characters are motivated by trauma. 10 years have passed since the first movie, and since then almost all of humanity has died. A few remaining survivors reside in San Francisco, but are running low on fuel to survive. The apes live near the dam that can generate power, and they are very protective of their home. There would be no story here if every character could just trust each other, because at the end of the day, the humans and apes don't care about the other, they just want to survive. But after what Dreyfus and Koba have been through, can you blame them for their fears? Koba is a character we got to know briefly in the first movie. For those who didn't remember his name, he was that ugly looking ape who had scars all over his body. He was tormented, tested on, and abused by humans. He has only known humans as these creatures who know nothing but inflicting pain on others. Koba didn't have a family growing up. He was in a cage his whole life, and just had to accept to being tested on. At that point, you cannot imagine a more miserable life experience. That's until Caesar freed him, and now Koba has a family. He not only has people that he cares about, but people that care for him. Now here comes the humans. They're weak and desperate, and what does Caesar decide to do? Help them. To Koba, it doesn't matter that the humans are suffering. All he sees is that the odds of the humans re-inflicting their torture onto him are increasing because Caesar is helping them. Koba's trauma runs so deep that there is no room for empathy. His trauma is so strong that even if there is a small chance humans can attack first, he cannot risk it. For all his life, Koba had no control. He was at the mercy of humans and their machines. So for maybe the first time, Koba takes control into his own hands. He tries to kill Caesar and make sure that the apes are the ones who attack first. He is not leaving anything up to chance. This is how you perfectly build a sequel. You take elements of the first movie and you build upon them in a natural way. Can you blame Koba for his fears and his trauma? I can't. I can blame him for planning a coup and killing other apes, but I can't blame him for his trauma. On the other side of the trauma coin, we have Dreyfus. It would be really easy for the storytellers to just have a mirror image of Koba. Maybe in the 10 years since Rise, a few apes killed Dreyfus's family, and with the brewing conflict, he's not taking anything by chance either. He's going to take out the apes so humans can survive. But that's not what happens. Dreyfus isn't motivated by the fear of the opposing side like Koba is. Dreyfus is motivated by the trauma of loss. There's this wonderful scene after the humans get power back where Dreyfus is able to turn on his iPad and he looks at pictures of people we can assume he lost. His friends, his family, all gone. That brief moment of joy turns to pain as he's reminded of how much he has lost. It would have been so easy if, like Malcolm and Ellie, Dreyfus just said, "I lost people too." But seeing the reaction from him is leagues more powerful than any words can convey. Dreyfus has gotten a second chance. He has a new family and new people to care for, and he is not going to lose them. He is not going to leave things up for chance. At the beginning of the third act, Dreyfus willingly blows himself up and a few of his friends because he is not going to let the people he cares cares about suffer. Their survival matters more than anything. And just like I said with Koba, can I blame him? Can I blame a man who has lost all his friends and family for not wanting to feel that pain again? I can't. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes explores trauma through Koba and Dreyfus. It teaches us why people can go to extremes and what makes them that extreme. It teaches us why some people have no room for empathy, because trauma runs so deep they cannot risk getting hurt again. Now, not everyone who's had a traumatic experience turns out the same as Koba and Dreyfus. In the middle of the scale, we have Malcolm and Caesar. So let's discuss these characters. Malcolm is the opposite of Dreyfus, not just because he's willing to trust the unknown and willing to take a chance with his future, but because he cares about more than just surviving. Dreyfus wants him and his people to survive no matter the cost. Malcolm wants his people to not only survive, but he wants them to survive in a world of compassion. Malcolm is fortunate enough to still have his son, and he wants to show his son how you should live, with compassion, with trust, and with belief in others. Malcolm's first thought is always to resolve things peacefully, and that is why on multiple occasions he risks his life to find peace. After the apes came to his town and threatened to fight if they came on ape land again, Malcolm decides to walk right into the ape land to find a peaceful solution. Now, just like how Dreyfus wasn't a perfect mirror to Koba, Malcolm isn't a perfect mirror to Caesar. So let's discuss the main character of the trilogy. Caesar's arc conveys a message that I find to be essential, especially in today's day and age. We live in a world that is very divided, whether that be over politics, religious ideas, national ideas, or something else. It is so easy to have an enemy in today's world. A person you may not know exists, but they are your enemy just because of a side they are on. It doesn't matter how that person ended up on that side. It doesn't matter how they were convinced to be on that side. It doesn't matter if their intentions are pure or not. They are your enemy. Look at someone like Blue Eyes. At the beginning of the movie, he has probably never seen a human before, but because of Koba's influence, he was led to hate the humans. It's often the youth who suffer the most, the youth who is led to believe lies about your supposed enemy. But deep down, Blue Eyes knew that this was wrong. This movie is filled with apes and humans viewing the other side as an enemy, viewing the other side as lesser than you are, worse than you are. As much as we love Caesar, he is in this camp to begin the movie. The conversation he has with Maurice in the opening minutes is very telling. They talk about humans and if they still think about humans. Caesar says he often does, but he knows that humans destroyed each other. When Maurice brings up the point that apes fight each other, Caesar basically says, but apes are our family. An ape will never kill another ape. To Caesar, apes are better than humans because he believes if the roles were reversed and apes were fighting a virus, apes would not turn on each other the way humans did. He of course has seen the good in humans, but he knows their dark side too. A dark side apes do not have. As the movie progresses, Caesar is repeatedly tempted by Koba. He knows Koba is erratic and is clouded by his emotions. But that is not a serious concern because Koba would never hurt his own people. Koba would never kill an ape, right? It's the pain in Caesar's face that always gets me. The realization and shock that not just any ape, but someone that was with him since the very beginning turned on him and tried to kill him. Caesar is inevitably rescued by Malcolm and brought to safety. All movie, Caesar has been telling others that apes would never hurt another ape. But just like humans, apes are capable of that same darkness. Apes aren't better than humans. They're the same. They face the same struggles and the same fears. This movie may use two different species to convey its message, but the message of the film to me is that we're all the same. These people we see as our enemy, these people that we see as savages or less than us, we are the same. We're all capable of violence, we're all capable of love, we all suffer from trauma, and we all fear our enemy. We are the same. That is why I find this message to be so powerful, especially in today's climate. Before moving on to the final movie in the trilogy, I want to discuss one more aspect of this movie, and it's how this movie builds tension. Right from the beginning, we establish what is at stake: war between humans and apes. All movie, our main characters are trying to avoid this. They are fearful of the other side, but they are willing to try and trust each other. We even get glimpses of peace. After the lights turn on, everything seems to be perfect. Trust has been built between Caesar and Malcolm, and both sides are going to live together in harmony. But this is a movie. If there was no conflict, then there wouldn't even be a story. Koba shoots Caesar, blames the humans, and all chances at peace have been thrown out the window. Maybe I I shouldn't have used the phrase building tension. Maybe I should have said this movie is a masterclass at building tragedy. When we go back to this scale I showed earlier, characters like Dreyfus and Koba exist so the war can happen. Characters like Caesar and Malcolm exist to show that peace could have happened. I love the framing of the battle scene at the end of the second act. It isn't glorified like other battles. It doesn't have that triumphant feeling that the battle on the bridge had at the end of the first movie. That movie, in a way, was a celebration of these apes fighting not only against oppression, but fighting together. When the apes win, it feels like freedom was achieved. During this battle, it is the exact opposite. Like this was all just a waste of life. How this whole conflict could have been avoided if both sides just understood that the other side is the same as they are. At the end of the movie, the people that started the war are all dead, and the people that tried to stop the war are still alive, but the damage has been done. War has started, and it cannot be stopped. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is a movie that touches on so many themes. It touches on the human condition, it touches on trauma, it touches on trust, it touches on compassion. This movie has so many lessons that people can learn from, especially in today's world. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes ended with the beginning of a war, so let's talk about war. Before continuing on with the rest of this video, only 5.6% of viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. War for the Planet of the Apes is surprisingly personal, but I shouldn't be surprised. Rise of the Planet of the Apes was not about the rise of the apes, it was about the rise of Caesar. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes was not about the dawn of a war, it was about how easy it is to paint other people as our enemies, and we think we are above that. War for the Planet of the Apes is not about the war between species, it's about people who can't come to terms with their pain. The movie begins and Caesar is exhausted. Years after the previous movie, Caesar is still dealing with the consequences of Koba's actions. Not only that, but it turns out other apes are siding with the humans because they are so fearful of this colonel. Caesar decides, in hope for peace, to let some of the human soldiers go as a sign of good faith. The humans thought Caesar was dead, and doing this is a message that he is not only alive, but willing to find peace. However, this decision was costly. During a surprise attack by the humans, Caesar temporarily leaves his family, only for him to come back to find his wife and son dead. The son we got to know quite well in the previous film is now dead to begin this film. It's one thing to lose people you love in war, it's another thing to not be there to protect them in their final moments, but there is also nothing more destroying to the soul than people taking advantage of your compassion. If Caesar showed no mercy and killed these four in the beginning of the movie, his family is probably still alive. But Caesar showed compassion, he tried for peace, and he suffered the worst consequence of that. The reason I want to highlight this is because War for the Planet of the Apes in its simplest terms is a revenge story. We've seen plenty of these stories, where the main character loses someone they love, and on their quest for vengeance they start to lose their own humanity, only for them to make the right choice at the end of the story and not choose revenge, but choose compassion. This is a bit of a tired trope, so I remember not being a big fan of it here, but after a rewatch, the reason I am not upset about it is because the initial tragedy was Caesar's fault. But not only that, it was the fault of his good nature. As I said before, it was his compassion that got his family killed. The reason this is so important is because we need a good reason for the main character to lose themselves. In these other revenge stories, the characters lose who they are just because they are thirsty for revenge. In this movie, Caesar loses who he was because who he was got his family killed. So we enter the second act and we see the signs that Caesar is consumed by vengeance. He abandons his people and his son so he can get revenge. But luckily, a few apes come along with him. Maurice, Luca, Rocket, and Bad Ape may appear to just tag along because Caesar wandering alone for 30 minutes would be quite boring, but for the narrative, all of these apes are a reminder to Caesar of a part of him he is losing. All of these apes are the way that they are because of Caesar, so to have them around gives Caesar strength later in the film. I haven't spoken about Maurice much in this video, but there's a reason why he's everyone's favorite ape. He's always the kindest and the most nurturing of the apes. I don't think a single time in this trilogy do we see Maurice fight. He's always there to help Caesar and others when they need it. The highlight for Maurice is his relationship to Nova. When the other apes walk into the room, they all have their guns up, but it's Maurice who shows concern for the girl. It doesn't matter that there are only downsides to bringing this girl along their trip. Maurice can't leave a child alone to die. This compassion that Maurice had was reflected by Nova later in the film when Caesar was on his deathbed. Had Maurice not shown compassion here, then Nova wouldn't have risked herself to help Caesar later on. The other Maurice moment I want to highlight was the scene where he talks to Nova in the sewers. At this point in the story, she's confused about herself. Is she a human or is she an ape? We obviously know that she's a human, but I love that it's not what Maurice focuses on. He tells her that she is Nova. She is her own person. That's one of the major themes of this trilogy. We're so focused on putting people into camps that we forget that every person is an individual who has their own personality and beliefs. Everyone is different, so I really appreciated this little moment from Maurice. It shows to me that the writers get the themes of this franchise. Luca is a character who isn't present much in this trilogy, but he gives his life to Caesar after a surprise attack. He too was a reflection on one of Caesar's best qualities, sacrifice. The same could be said for Rocket, who was there all the way from the beginning. He took a rough beating and volunteered to be thrown into one of the cages just so Caesar can get some time to feel a little bit better. Even after all these moments of selflessness from his friends, Caesar still cannot let go of his hate. The moment in the film where Caesar realizes all his people have been captured was devastating. Not just because they were captured, but also because Caesar, again, wasn't there to protect them. It's crazy what vengeance can do to you. You can be so hurt by something that you will end up repeating it anyway. Caesar felt like his biggest failure was not being there for his family, and this time again, he wasn't there for his family. I want to take a second to talk about the Colonel. The Colonel isn't in this movie all that much, but his story is surprisingly powerful. The Colonel's motivation is simple. He fears the end of humanity, but not simply their extinction, but everything that makes a human human. Their history, their religions, their ability to communicate. All that is on the line right now. In this movie, Caesar is consumed by vengeance against the Colonel, but the Colonel is consumed by vengeance against this virus. He will not let it win. It doesn't matter what he has to do, it doesn't matter who he has to hurt, he is not going to let this virus win. It's not, however, just because of his pride of being a human, but also because of what he's lost. We learn in the middle of the film that the Colonel's son got infected with this new form of the virus, and in order to stop the spread, he looked into his loving son's eyes and killed him. According to the Colonel, he didn't kill his son, the virus did, and he wants vengeance. I hope you are starting to pick up a pattern here with the comparisons between Caesar and the Colonel. Both lost their families to something, and now both will do whatever it takes to make sure that something doesn't win. They'll betray who they are and put others in harm's way just to make sure they are the winners, that they beat this something. However, as I briefly stated, there is a difference here. The Colonel's son didn't die from the virus. He died from his father. I think deep down the Colonel regrets this. Sometimes the reason people sink down such a deep hole is so they can justify their actions. The Colonel can't afford to lose this war against the virus because he already killed his son because of it. To say humans can survive and thrive without their speech or higher level of thinking is something he cannot accept, because if he did accept that, he killed his son for nothing. The irony here is that the Colonel ultimately gets the virus because of the compassion of an infected little girl. The Colonel believes this virus basically renders a human dead, but this girl is proof that that is not true. The ability to speak and the ability to think at a higher level is not what makes us special. It's what makes us unique. What makes us special is our ability to love each other, to smile together, to be loyal to each other. At the end of the film, Nova looks happier than ever. Sure, she can't speak, but she's happy. The Colonel doesn't want to be happy. He wants to be dominant, and that is what leads to his downfall. Planet of the Apes is not a story about both sides being right. It's not about both apes and humans being justified in their fear of domination and replacement. It's about how fear and pain can lead to an endless cycle of violence and death. And we're all vulnerable to this, even the best of us. Throughout the movie, Caesar is haunted by Koba. Not so much because of what Koba did, but because of who he was. Koba was someone who could not escape his hatred, and Caesar comes to accept that he is the same, but he isn't the same. When he goes to kill the Colonel once and for all and finally get vengeance, he comes across a man who wants to end his own life, a man who has lost everything, a man who killed his own son because of the virus, so he has no choice but to kill himself too. However, all movie, Caesar has reminded himself of the compassion around him, whether that be Maurice's compassion for Nova, Nova's compassion for Caesar, Rocket's sacrifice for Caesar, and Luca's sacrifice for Caesar. When he sees a pathetic human, a human so vulnerable and so weak, he has a catharsis. It's not in Caesar's nature to heal himself through harm. In Rise, he didn't want humans to die. This is why he told his fellow apes not to kill humans. Even when he let Koba kill Jacobs, it was because he knew Koba needed this moment. He wouldn't do it for himself. In Dawn, he doesn't kill Koba because he wants revenge for starting a war. He did it because he wants to protect his family. family, his people. In war, he changed. He abandons the protection of his family and seeks vengeance so he can feel better. But the Colonel's vulnerability reminds him of the morals with which he'd always lived and led. Letting the hate go is also why he didn't leave him to suffer. He took pity in the end and felt a very unexpected sympathy. Caesar has never been cruel, so he doesn't spare the Colonel because he thinks killing is wrong. He doesn't spare the Colonel because he forgives him. He spares the Colonel because he just can't pull the trigger. That's not who he is. That is what makes Caesar such an interesting character. But of course, we need to discuss the ending. When talking about the ending of Rise, I mentioned how it honored the themes of the original series, that man ultimately destroyed themselves. I love how that is reflected here in this movie. All movie, we were anticipating this battle that was going to take place. Even when their numbers were at their fewest, humanity couldn't help themselves from fighting each other. When this army gets their victory, they all end up dying from the avalanche. I do think this moment was a bit goofy, that they all just died because of a major avalanche, but hey, it ties into the themes of this movie. Now, the real reason I want to highlight the ending of this movie are the biblical ties to Caesar's death. For those who aren't aware, the prophet Moses was tasked with leading the Israelites to the promised land. When he arrived at the promised land, God told Moses that he would let Moses see the promised land, but he would not let him enter it. The reasons aren't exactly clear. Apparently this is a debated topic, but the short story is Moses was not allowed into the promised land because of something he did. I think you guys can see where I'm going with this. After all the struggle Caesar has faced, after all the pain and loss, he accomplished his dream and led his people to safety. He led them to the promised land, but he could not enter it himself, having ultimately paid the price for his vengeful nature earlier in the film. Even though Caesar in the moment of truth didn't give in to his hate and kill the Colonel, he still was down the path of vengeance for a bit. One could argue that if he didn't abandon his people in the beginning of the movie, that they would have never been captured in the first place. But also when Caesar had the chance to escape, he decided to go back to confront the Colonel one more time. He could have escaped unharmed, but his hate wouldn't let him. Caesar led his people to the promised land, but he was not allowed to enter. Whether you like this biblical tie is up to you, but it's certainly worth noting the similarities between Caesar's story and what's in the Bible. I think at the end of the day, War for the Planet of the Apes is my least favorite of the trilogy, but that does not mean it was a bad movie at all. This movie taught us a powerful lesson on vengeance. It taught us how people react to their pain and how it always leads to more violence. Caesar's story was beautiful, and this trilogy capped off one of the best movie trilogies and one of the most underrated movie trilogies ever made. So, the Planet of the Apes trilogy all these years later. What do you think about the films? Do you love all these films as much as me? Do you think they're not good at all? Or are you somewhere in between? Let me know down below. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to hit the Claude Squad, and I will see you guys next time.